Mr. President, nuclear missiles will strike our country in 14 minutes. I know it's your first day in office, so I'm going to walk you through it, but you're the only one who can authorize our nuclear retaliation in response, and you've only got a few minutes to make a decision. As you know, tensions have escalated rapidly in the past few days. Today's Joint Allied Aerial Defense exercise began just minutes before we detected the launch. A simple misunderstanding, maybe. We assume the sudden attack is meant to neutralize as many of our nuclear forces as possible. But that doesn't matter now. Missiles are in the air, and we can't shoot all of them down. Why? Because intercontinental ballistic missiles are basically rockets launched into space before re-entering the atmosphere over their target and releasing many different warheads, higher and faster than anything you can send after them. We need to get you to the bunker. Here's what we know. 4 minutes ago, our new infrared monitoring satellites detected 112 bursts consistent with ICBM launches from the enemy's inner territories. For some reason, only 20 of their 80 underground nuclear silos seem to have fired, so we suspect most of them were transporter erector launchers. You know, trucks with big missiles on them. It's unclear why they didn't use all their silos. They might just not work after more than 30 years, or they might be keeping them in reserve. The fog of war is keeping many things unclear. Aerospace Command thinks the ICBMs are targeting our nuclear command centers, silos, and major Air Force and Navy bases, ending this war before we have a chance to act. The enemy's strategic doctrine prioritizes military targets and our nuclear weapon systems, but their secondary targets are our industry and infrastructure, all refineries, power stations, and deep water ports, all located near or in major population centers. We won't know the exact casualty count for a few weeks. Deaths from the blast and burns may be a few million today. It's morning rush hour, and there's not much to be done for people stuck in traffic. People in major metro areas can't really evacuate, but emergency broadcasts are being sent out to shelter in place and away from windows. Radiation exposure for intact population centers is highly dependent on the weather over the next week. We might be looking at dozens of millions of deaths by the end of the month. For the next few minutes, we can still respond. But you need to decide. We've got 1,500 warheads across our silos, bombers, and submarines. The 400 in silos need to be launched now before they get taken out. 46 nuclear-capable bombers on high alert can be ready to take off in 2 minutes, though we need to transmit the order right away to get them out of the blast radius if you want to consider using them. Of our 40 nuclear submarines, 5 are presently at sea. While they're submerged, they're undetectable, so that's our backup for a nuclear retaliation if we lose our silos and bombers. We could try to use them to bomb out their remaining silo fields before they can launch them. The sooner you commit to it, the better the chance we have of preventing a further exchange after our retaliation. Updates. We have radar confirmation that the enemy ICBMs have completed their burn and deployed their warheads. Our best guess is that each missile will deploy at least 6 re-entry vehicles, about 600 in total, which is the part that carries a warhead back into the atmosphere during its terminal descent onto the target, and with many more decoys on top of that, inflatable balloons meant to waste any anti-missiles. We're now tracking nearly 4,000 potential targets. Our anti-ballistic missiles have been launched and will begin their intercept in another minute. We'll do our best to protect the capital, although there really is no defense. Wait, confirming a partial radar blackout. Our systems seem to be glitchy. The enemy must have anticipated we'd launch our interceptors and pre-detonated a few warheads at high altitude. That ionizes the atmosphere and creates radar interference. Our interceptors should still operate okay. They've had a 55% success rate in tests, but never with this many decoys or with radar interference this intense. We might shoot down 50 objects, but there's no guarantee they're warheads. It looks like most bombs are going to get through. This is our last chance to counterattack. We're out of time. Our silo launch sequence takes 5 minutes. We have to transmit and confirm a launch order, and the missile needs time to clear the blast radius of the incoming bomb. This is a lot to take in, but the war plan is made. You just need to enter the launch authorization codes and push this button to transmit them. You can't do anything else to save more of our people. If you don't launch now, then this war will be over before it even begins. You understand, this is our one chance, right? The effect? Enemy civilian casualties are hard to estimate, but should be similar to ours. A few million right away, perhaps a few tens of million by the end of the month. The total fallout from their attacks and ours might trigger a nuclear winter, potentially killing billions around the world, but that might happen even if we don't retaliate. I'm sure you have questions, but you have to give orders without expecting answers right now. With an attack of this scale, there's no guarantee communications or assets will be intact in a few minutes. We're out of time. We need a decision, sir. Can we launch? Nuclear wars aren't regular wars. They only last minutes, and in times of crisis, small conflicts can rapidly spiral out of control. Anything from small communication lags to sensor errors to just uncertainty in the fog of war mean that no leader will ever have a complete idea of what's happening as a crisis unfolds. When tensions are high, accidents or misunderstandings can steer leaders, even those with good intentions, to launch a nuclear attack. Confused and with incomplete information, a single person, yes, it's really just one single person who decides, can literally make civilization-ending decisions, killing hundreds of millions of people in the time it takes to watch a YouTube video. This story is fiction, but the world came very close to this several times. In 1995, Russian radar detected a submarine-launched missile, and their nuclear forces went on full alert, except it was actually a scientific rocket to study auroras. In 1979, US computers reported a full-scale Soviet attack with only minutes to respond, except it was a training tape being incorrectly loaded into a computer. In 1983, the Soviet satellite alert system showed 5 ICBMs launched from the US, but it was a false alarm caused by sunlight reflected on clouds. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, a Soviet submarine with no contact to Moscow for several days concluded that nuclear war had begun and decided to launch a nuclear torpedo. Luckily, the authorization of 3 officers was required. One of them, Vasily Arshipov, opposed it. But what if he hadn't? Any safeguard can fail, no matter how carefully designed it might be. And decisions are being made right now to build new weapons and missile systems that commit the world to another century of nuclear stalemate, complicated further by China's emergence as a new nuclear superpower. Simply accepting that the existence of nuclear weapons is inevitable might mean their use is inevitable. But the world doesn't have to be this way. Even incremental steps taking apart one bomb at a time will eventually result in a world with none. During the Cold War, the world had over 70,000 nuclear weapons. Through arms reduction treaties, that number is now about 12,500. Progress is not guaranteed, but it's also not impossible. Governments and militaries are not separate from their nations, they're part of them, just like you. You have the power to make demands of your leaders, and often this begins with just being aware of an issue. If you want to learn more, we've compiled a number of resources for you in the video description and our sources. Nuclear war would forever split human history into anything that happened before and the post-war apocalypse. In the worst case, mass fires consume everything within tens of thousands of square kilometers, killing hundreds of millions within hours. But the worst part comes after that. Nuclear war could trigger a nuclear winter that might kill billions, maybe even completely collapsing our civilization. How does it work, and what would it look like? Fire causes winter. When a nuclear weapon is detonated, a bubble of gas hotter than the sun is forced into existence, so hot that everything within kilometers immediately begins to burn. The terror bubble expands rapidly, filling the sky over its target, creating a devastating shockwave that causes most of the immediate destruction. Basically, you break a lot of stuff and set it on fire, and in the worst case, this turns into a firestorm that consumes everything and everyone on the ground. Right after the explosion, a gigantic mushroom cloud rises over the destruction like a demon throning over its perverse work, but in the following hours, a far more deadly cloud forms. The fire burning cities, forests or fields heats up so much air that it creates its own microclimate and wind system. Hot air and hot smoke rise, pulling in fresh air from the surroundings and fresh oxygen, stoking the flames even more. This creates an updraft and forms a colossal pyrocumulonimbus cloud that carries the soot and aerosols from the flames high into the stratosphere. Under normal conditions, the soot rising from a big fire is quickly washed out by rain. But a pyrocumulonimbus cloud can reach altitudes well above the height where rain clouds form. Once above the tropopause, there's simply no weather to remove soot from the atmosphere, so it can stay aloft for years. If this happens to a single city, it's a tragedy, but a fairly local one. But in a full-scale nuclear war, Warring nations following the cold logic of mutually assured destruction could use hundreds or even thousands of nuclear weapons all at once, creating hundreds of firestorms, sending up to 150 million tons of soot, a cube the size of a skyscraper, directly into the stratosphere. In the next few days and weeks, the soot begins to blanket the Earth at high altitudes, absorbing light high above the ground and preventing sunlight from reaching the surface. This is not like science fiction where the sky turns dark and the sun disappears. Winter is what happens when just a little less sunlight hits the ground, and now suddenly a lot less sunlight gets through. Yesterday, the world was normal. Today, nuclear winter begins. Winter causes hunger. How bad nuclear winter would be is still an active area of research. It all hinges on one thing: how much stuff will burn really hot? How many firestorms will be caused by the heat of the explosions? This depends on many factors, from the materials a city is made of, to the time of the year, if a forest is nearby, and so on. So just keep in mind we're working with some assumptions. Here's the good news. Nuclear winter is not permanent, and definitely no new ice age. The effects on the climate only last as long as the soot remains in the atmosphere, which is at most a decade or so until it clears out and temperatures normalize. The bad news is that this causes almost immediate climate change within a few weeks. It disrupts our climate system faster than any living being can adapt to. In this new climate, our seasons are suddenly all wrong. Winters are much longer, summers shorter and colder, or gone altogether. This also means less evaporation over the oceans, which means less rain and maybe large-scale droughts. This is bad because our food eats the sun. Without good summers and enough rain, growing seasons shrink or even collapse. The majority of humanity lives in an area called the mid-latitudes, a strip of land that has the ideal temperature for our species, not just because it's not too hot or cold, it's also where the plants we eat grow best. The vast majority of the food we eat stems from a few highly efficient crops that are mostly produced in a few very agriculturally productive regions like the US Great Plains or Ukraine. From these bread and rice baskets of the world, they get traded and shipped around the world. In the worst case of a full-scale nuclear war, the temperatures in the mid-latitudes will probably stay below freezing for several years. Nothing at all can grow under these conditions, and the world's bread baskets would suddenly turn empty. If food production crashes, the world's food producers would very likely ramp up prices or even stop selling food to other countries, if they're still able to farm their fields at all. It's easy to calculate how many people can be alive on Earth. You take all the calories we can produce and divide them by what the average person needs to survive. If you have more people than calories, then within a few weeks, you don't anymore. Humanity has only a few weeks' supply of crops and food, not enough to survive this drastic drop in production. But the climate is not the only issue. Modern industrialized agriculture is a complex affair that relies on functioning supply chains to provide unthinkable amounts of industrially produced fertilizer and chemicals to kill weeds and vermin. Massive numbers of specialized modern machinery is plowing, sowing, harvesting, and distributing. After a nuclear war, especially if the countries that produce the food were part of the nuclear exchange, there may simply be no more fuel, fertilizer, or machine parts because there are no more oil refineries, ports, and other essential infrastructure left, damaging global food production even more. Okay, so now that we've set the stage, let's look at what science says about the actual wars that could happen. Actual nuclear war. Today, there are two main conflicts that scientists think about when making calculations of nuclear winter: a nuclear war between India and Pakistan, and one between the US and Russia. The most likely smallish nuclear exchange would be fought today between India and Pakistan, with relatively low-yield weapons. Even in a pretty mild nuclear war like this, the immediate explosions would kill around 27 million people, which is horrible enough. In just a few hours, more people would die than in all of World War I. The ensuing fires would not cause a nuclear winter, but a mild nuclear autumn. But even this would disrupt the climate and thereby global agriculture, enough to starve up to 250 million people worldwide. Unfortunately, India and Pakistan are in an arms race and have been increasing the number and power of warheads in their arsenal. The next stage of escalation would be war with hundreds of nuclear weapons, the bombs and fires destroying many major population centers and killing over 100 million people. A war on this scale would cause a nuclear winter that would damage global agriculture enough to cut the available calories for humanity in half. The number of people that starve to death would be as high as 2 billion. 1 in 4 humans alive today. The worst-case scenario is a full-scale global war between NATO nations and Russia, or China, which also continues to build its nuclear arsenal. In a war between a former, future and current superpower, thousands of nuclear weapons could be detonated. In a scenario with around 4,400 nuclear weapons, 360 million people would perish right away. We have no other event to even compare the death and destruction to. It's like humanity dropping an asteroid on itself. The nuclear winter that follows such an apocalyptic war would tank human calorie production by as much as 90%. Not only would almost all of our agriculture take an immediate and deadly hit, the climate would take at least a decade to recover. Because a war like this would specifically hit the world regions that produce most of the food for humanity, recovery will be much, much harder than with other conflicts. Within 2 years, the global death toll from starvation could rise to about 5 billion. In mid-latitude countries like Russia, China, Canada, the US and much of Europe, only a few % of the population might survive. Humanity will never be the same again. While nowhere is truly safe, some nations in the Southern Hemisphere may fare well enough to endure while the rest of the world collapses. All the nuclear weapon states are in the Northern Hemisphere, so a few countries like Australia, New Zealand and Argentina may be able to endure for a bunch of different reasons. Their nuclear winter would be milder, they have a lot of livestock that would not be as affected as crops, so they would probably stop exporting food and focus on keeping their own people alive, assuming they aren't invaded for their food by other starving nations. It's safe to say that the world would become extremely unpleasant for a long time, and it's impossible to know how many people would have died when the nuclear winter ends. In the worst case, human civilization could collapse and the survivors would be thrown back thousands of years, slowly trying to recover a world full of scars and graves. Eventually, when they've rebuilt civilization, would they ever build nuclear weapons again?